Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. This is our first session of the 2021 season. After spending last year studying the Apocryphal material to the Old Testament, we return to the New Testament this year, where our class actually devotes most of its study time over the last 15-20 years. This year, we will devote our study to Paul's genuine letters, and I'll explain what they are a little more here later, with Corinthian letters being the focus for this year. I doubt that we will get through them completely as we make our slow progress through them, but that's where we'll be studying. Following in today's class, and for probably the next two at least, maybe three, some introductory sessions on general material in the New Testament that scholars tell us we need to know if we're going to study Paul, and then some information specifically about Paul. We will then go into tackling 1 Corinthians chapter and verse in slow, in-depth study, as our class normally does. I and my notes will rely very heavily on modern scholarship. Not just one scholar, but a number of scholars. And most of these scholars are what's referred to as Pauline scholars. That is, they're known to be experts in Paul's letters and are recognized such by the Bible colleges and so forth. For those new to our class, we have already studied in depth two of Paul's letters, Romans and Galatians. So today, for those who are not there, as well as a refresher for those who were with us before, let's review some points about Paul and the New Testament that scholars urge us to know and remember as we study his writings. Christians often think of the New Testament as a single book with, I would say, a single religious message. Modern scholars remind us that is far from the case. Instead, it is a collection of 27 different books written by at least 16 different authors over a period of about 70 years, maybe more. Its books present different views and ethics as to Jesus, as to what he said, as to what salvation is, how people should live, etc. Thus, each book needs to be studied in detail, carefully, to find the individual writer's point of view, set in the cultural and historical settings of its time. These books of the New Testament stood and circulated as individual books for a long time before they became part of the Bible. Not just Paul's books, but essentially the books of the New Testament. They were put together, we now know from discoveries made in the Middle East over the last 50 years, that in 367 AD, they were united into a single canon under the leadership of Bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. His list is the same list as what we have in our New Testament today. Although the orders are a little different, I think, but the list is the same. Several scholars remind us that the church has historically misinterpreted Paul's letters in particular, especially because they assumed he was writing in the context of a Bible with the Gospels already in place. The main flaw in this thinking is this idea that Paul was writing general instructions. That is, that he was writing a Bible to a Christian faith audience. And that is not the case, as we'll see as we go through it, based on the best scholarship surrounding Paul's letters. So That's what I want to spend most of the day elaborating on, is to get that foundation there, because for some people this may be the first time they've ever been exposed to such. But it is where the bulk of respected scholars thinking are at today, that are New Testament scholars and Pauline scholars. Instead, Paul's genuine letters were written, and he dead, before anything else was written that made the New Testament canon. Moreover, all of Paul's letters are situationally based or situationally dependent, and not general instructions. He wrote to a particular church or a particular person, in the case of Philemon, about a specific issue or issues that had come up in the church at his time. Paul was not writing a Bible. His writings became part of the New Testament, as we said, 300 years after his death, basically. And they are the first thing that made the actual canon of the New Testament that was written. So all of Paul's works was written before anything else that made the canon is there in the New Testament. At the outset of studying Paul's writings, it is important to realize he did not write 7 of the letters that are in the New Testament that are attributed to him. Letters that scholars are in good agreement today, that he wrote only 7 of the letters that are there, which are 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, and 1st Thessalonians, but not 2nd Thessalonians. There's a few more that might want to throw that are still respected scholars that might throw 2nd Thessalonians in, but the bulk of the scholarship says no, it's not there. These are known as the genuine Paul authored letters. The other 7 letters in the New Testament attributed to him were written after his death by others, and his name then assigned to it, which was not uncommon at all in his day and in the time that the Bible was put together. They are similar in style, but differ significantly in theology and ethics from those that Paul seems to be writing under. Dr. Sumney, professor of religion at Lexington Theological Seminary, teaches it like this, and I kind of like the way he says it. After Paul's death, when issues arose, they wrote as if he were still alive, assuming if he were, he would have had this to say about it. That's a nice way of putting it. Sumney's quick, though, to advise that these other letters differ significantly from the true Pauline letters. Dr. David Bate, professor of religion and history at Ohio State University, advises to draw your conclusions about Paul from what you can deduce and infer from his 7 letters, not those attributed to him. He further adds, even Acts is not a primary history related to Paul, even though it has a good bit to say about Paul, as it was written 40 to 70 years later than Paul lived. Acts may be historically accurate, he says, concerning Paul, but we are on safer grounds using Paul's own letters concerning Paul's thinking and opinions, albeit we have to understand any bias that might be therein that Paul's writing about himself. We should also appreciate that the New Testament says nothing about Paul's death, which is most interesting since nearly all of it was written, and maybe all of it we think except Paul's letters, after his death. Many scholars argue this omission was deliberate and they put it together. Why? Would make a very good research topic and discussion topic. Later Christian tradition tells us, or says to us, that's the way we've been taught, that Paul was executed in Rome under the rulership of Emperor Nero. And Nero ruled from early to mid-60s AD. Before any of the other books of the New Testament were written, most likely. That's the general position. Dr. Bart Ehrman, professor of religion at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, says it is important to appreciate Paul's theology and ethics drawn from his writings rather than mixing in theology from other letters. He says Paul tells you enough that we can draw some good opinions. His writings are textbook on moral reasoning involving the relationship of true believers as an individual fitting into a church community. He clearly argues for unity that respects diversity. And that's not necessarily the case in some of the other letters with his name on it. Paul's community of faith leaves no one out, he says, but does reflect social sensitivities within a particular community that may be different in another community. At that time and place is where Paul is writing for each letter. He relates to them as a father figure. Moreover, Ehrman indicates that Paul had a very clear approach in how he handled things. He's not always the easiest understood. He's not saying that. He's saying he has a clear approach as to what he's doing. He was well educated for his time and well schooled in rhetoric and religion. His approach was centered on Paul's understanding, that is, Paul's understanding and belief as a practicing Pharisaical Jew as to how the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus the Christ fits into the fulfillment of the Jewish Messiah. His movement was clearly within that sect or subsect of Judaism. Paul was a Greek-speaking diaspora Jew from Asia Minor, that is modern-day Turkey. He was not a native Israelite. He writes in formal Greek, the common language of his day in the eastern half of the Roman Empire. He writes very good Greek, in fact. He probably did not know Hebrew well enough to write in it, if he knew it at all. He probably knew enough to understand some ceremonies and so forth, but which they say was common in their time. The Bible he quoted always in his 7 letters is the Greek Septuagint, which contains that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible plus those books of the Apocryphas that we just spent the last year studying. He says, I am of the tribe of Benjamin and a good Pharisee to my belief. Those are powerful words. They pack a lot of information in that little statement of what he just said. The problem is he assumes you know what that means. From those details, scholars tell us we can probably safely surmise that Paul could fit Jesus into his belief, as they were flexible interpreters of the Scripture. Oh yes, he had problems at the beginning, he persecuted the church, etc. But once he got through that idea, whatever the force was that changed his mind, there's room in that branch of Judaism at that time for this to fit in. And what we know as Paul's churches were were sects were within the Jewish denomination. They were not Christian. The word Christian came about much later. We first learn of it in Acts, and Acts was written many years later. The Pharisees were acceptable on the concept of apocalyptic eschatology. That is, they were looking forward to the coming of a Messiah, establishment of God's kingdom, and the judgment of all people. They believed in the resurrection of the dead. Consequently, Paul's sect of Judaism had room to fit the new belief of Jesus as a Messiah, albeit not quite the type of figure they had expected. So the churches of Paul were sects within Judaism. They were not identified as Christian, as I said, until much later. So Paul lays out his belief best, I think, in what I've read in Romans, which we spent a lot of time going over that aspect of Paul's writing when we studied that book. And I'll be referring to it again periodically. Paul believes his converts, who are mainly Gentiles, should live ethical lives, not because the Old Testament or the Torah, the law, if you will, mandated it, but because they now represent God's people, God's chosen. That is God's chosen people. They become God's elect with and through, as Paul would say, their own faith and belief that the life, death, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ was the fulfillment of God's new covenant that he established with mankind, I should say. And that's all mankind, and not confined just to the Israelites. Consequently, if you are God's chosen, is his idea, show it in your actions towards other humans, your own personal behavior, and your appreciation of God's grace for this gift that you cannot earn. It is that understanding, belief, and ethics that Paul will use as he argues in a style called deliberative rhetoric. That is an attempt to influence you on what things should be now, that is, at his time and place, while addressing issue after issue that arise in the church as he writes and attempts to persuade these people as to what they should be doing at that time and place. Recall from Romans, where he wrote that it was Jesus Christ's death and resurrection that put mankind on the right relationship with God and not the keeping of the law as a religious ritual. He called this whole process as justification to God by faith. Justification by faith is what it often reduced to. Furthermore, Paul even argues that if you are keeping some law or religious ritual because you believe it is necessary or mandated to secure your, to earn or secure your salvation, you are a novice. And what does that term mean in Paul's language? That's the term they use before the person passes their test for bar mitzvah. In other words, for the lack of a better term, he's saying, in other words, you need to study more. You need to keep studying and learning. Paul's writings make it clear that he also believes in apocalyptic Judaism, which most Pharisees did, as did Jesus, as did John the Baptist, as did the majority of the community at the Dead Sea Scrolls. That is, that resurrection of the dead and judgment will come at the end of the age. To Paul, however, he makes it clear that that age has already begun with the Messiah, Jesus Christ, being the start of it as the first fruit. In other words, the first fruit to be gathered at this end of the age. Therefore, he feels certain that God's plan for mankind has been certified. He's confident. He writes as a very confident writer. He feels confident he knows what's going on now that he understands who the Messiah is. He felt certain that this was God's plan for mankind, and he would be, and that would be completed ultimately whenever there was widespread justice available and practiced by all of God's people under this new covenant. Therefore, he had plans to spread his message that he was teaching and establishing churches throughout the world, and he tells us in each letter where he's planning to go next. He didn't always get there, and some of what's in those letters are the stumbling blocks. So that's essentially Paul. Next week, we will look more at the Corinthian community in our introduction before we get into the body of the text itself. So I hope you have a good week, and we look forward to our study this year in the Corinthian letters of Paul.